The liquid culture.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Liquid Culture with me, Mitchell Chirac. Actually, should probably say part one of this week's episode of The Liquid Culture. Part one of a three-part series that I wanted to do. I wanted to break it up for you guys because the subject, the topic for this week's post is something that can get a little lengthy. It's got a lot of kind of information there that I wanted to put out to kind of help you guys in your search for various wines and to understand them better. And it can get a little bit content heavy, and I know that a lot of you guys have a lot going on, so I'm trying to kind of chop these videos up into something that's a little more approachable, as opposed to doing one big 30-minute video. Want to try and cut that into maybe 3 10-minute videos and blast those out kind of over the course of the week so that you guys can have something a little bit smaller, a little smaller bite to chew off in learning about these things. So the subject matter, in fact, for this project is sparkling wine. The reason I say sparkling wine is that what I want to cover today is some terms and some kind of production methods that not only are done in Champagne, but they're done kind of across the board in various other regions that can't call their wine Champagne because they're not made in Champagne, but they're made in the exact same style. So let's talk about that for a second. So a lot of people, when they're talking about sparkling wine in general, I know my wife is certainly in this category. If you say you go to a restaurant and you say, hey, I just want a glass of champagne, do you do like a champagne by the glass? Some places, a lot of places do, but a lot of other places have other types of sparkling wines by the glass, but they're not necessarily Champagne. So Champagne is a region in France that produces sparkling wine. They're the most well-known region in France for sparkling wine production, but to call wine Champagne, it has to be made in the Champagne region. Much like, to call a wine a Rioja, it has to be made in Rioja. To call a wine a Bordeaux, you have to, make that wine in Bordeaux. So Champagne's the exact same. And in fact, Rob Lowe in Wayne's World, he did an incredible job explaining what Champagne is and why it's called Champagne. If you haven't seen Wayne's World, classic movie from the 90s, but kind of in that like 80s style, definitely check it out. Rob Lowe, Mad Wreck, check it out. Wayne's World. Anyways, so while France does lead the world in sparkling wine production, honestly, only a portion of that comes from Champagne. So you can have other sparkling wines from all over France, and not just France, but all over the world, that are sparkling wines, but they are not Champagne, but are made in the Method Champenoise, or traditional method, or classic method of sparkling wine production. And that's what we're talking about today, since that is the most common method of producing a sparkling wine. And we're going to go through some different kind of styles and some different kind of terms that you might see with sparkling wine made in this method, but we're going to do it with a domestic sparkler. Gruet from New Mexico might sound odd. New Mexico sparkling wines might not be something that you've heard of before. I can assure you, Gruet crushes it. This is one of my all-time favorite sparkling wines, not just domestic sparkling wines, not just value sparkling wines, but favorite sparkling wines, period. I think these guys do a phenomenal job. They're a little bit of a larger production winery, and because of that, you can find their wines a little bit more readily and at a very, very nice value. But don't take that as, oh, it's a cheap bottle of wine, it's probably not going to be very good. In my opinion, Gruet makes the best $15 brut champagne-style sparkling wine that you can find on the shelves at Whole Foods, Specs, Total Wine, wherever. That's my opinion. Try it, see what you think. We are going to be working on some of their a little bit more difficult to find wines that I actually picked up on a trip that my wife and I took to Santa Fe. We visited their tasting room there in Santa Fe, went through a tasting there. All the wines were fantastic. Bought some wines that are not so readily found outside of that area. But I wanted to do that in an attempt to kind of teach you guys some of these terms. So let's talk a little bit about the process of making sparkling wine in the champagne method. So what you have is you start with a dry wine. You make a dry, still, sparkling wine, usually a pretty high acid wine because you want to retain that acidity through the remainder of the fermentation process that takes place. And you know, sparkling wines, they're known for that good sharp acidity. So you start with a nice high acid, dry, still wine. Totally ferments to completion. Then at that point, goes in the bottle, you put a little bit of extra sugar, a little bit of extra yeast, cap it with a bottle cap like you would get on a beer bottle. At that point, what's going to happen inside of the bottle is that additional yeast is going to eat up that additional sugar that you've added, and it's going to create a secondary fermentation. What happens when you create a secondary fermentation in a closed space is it expands that CO2, and if it doesn't have anywhere to go, it gets absorbed into the wine. So what happens in Champagne and a lot of places, the wines are put on racks, faced kind of at an angle downward, so that as that fermentation's happening and those dead yeast cells are starting to die off and fall to the neck of the bottle, you're constantly kind of turning them. A lot of times these days it's done on a big gyroplate, but really the traditional method is to hand turn them. It's called riddling. That secondary fermentation is happening inside the bottle. You have all that carbonation that is just kind of being absorbed into the wine, and after a period of time, those bottles are popped, caps are popped off, that additional yeast is taken out. That's called disgorgement. And at that point, the winemaker has a decision to make. Do I take it from there and just pop a cork in, or do I add a little bit of extra kind of sugary kind of wine substance on top of that to kind of balance out some of that acidity and the sharpness from that carbonation? Now, at that point, once that's done, cork goes in, wire cage, foil sometimes, and then they're either, you know, kind of bottle aged at that point or sent off for distribution. So that's the method that all Method Champenoise champagne or sparkling wine goes through. That's what this went through, and that's what your wines from Champagne go through. But really what you have is a lot of different variations that can take place there depending on, you know, where the champagne or sparkling wine is being made. There can be a difference in the fruit that's used. There can be a difference in kind of what you see on the label. So what we are going to start with today is the vintage Gruet Blanc de Blanc. So we've got a couple of things to unpack here. So again, Gruet producer, New Mexico. They're based in Albuquerque. Their production facility is in Albuquerque. They also have a tasting room in New Mexico, or I'm sorry, in Santa Fe. Production facility in Albuquerque with a tasting room, another tasting room in Santa Fe. So if you're ever in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, go check them out. The Gruet family started making wines in the 50s in France, moved to the U.S. in the 80s and set up shop in New Mexico. First vintage was in 1989, and everything's kind of skyrocketed from there. They actually have a really awesome kind of timeline if you go on their website. It's a really cool little illustrated timeline on their website on the About Us page that goes through their entire process of kind of when they started, when they won their first awards, and all that kind of cool stuff. So I would check that out, and of course I'll have some more information on the write-up on the site. But again, first vintage was in 1989, and this is their 2012 vintage. So something that you will see a lot when you start really getting into champagne or sparkling wine is vintage versus non-vintage. So non-vintage is the very kind of readily available classic style. So your kind of Veuve Clicquots and your Moet Chandons there. You know, if you go to the liquor store to buy, you know, a decent bottle of champagne, generally you're buying something that you recognize that's like a house style. style, non-vintage champagne. The reason for that is in the Champagne region, the weather is really, really harsh. Very cold, a lot of rain, hailstorms, fungal infections. It's very difficult, in fact, to get a really good vintage of grapes in Champagne. So what they do is they will take grapes from various vintages, wines that they have produced from various vintages, and blend them together to create what they call a house style. That's the non-vintage champagne. So your standard yellow label Veuve Clicquot, that is a non-vintage house style champagne. In other regions, that's not as difficult to do. It's not as difficult to get a nice crop of grapes. So you can find vintage sparkling wines and a little bit more readily available in other places. In Champagne, to find a vintage sparkling wine, you're going to be paying some money. Any sort of vintage, like a Dom Perignon, that's a vintage champagne, always a vintage champagne. You've got even like say Veuve Clicquot makes a vintage champagne. Bruno Paillard, one of my favorite champagne houses, they make a vintage champagne. Those bottles, depending on who the producer is, are generally going to be upwards of $100+. Even some of the cheaper prices you can maybe find like 60 or 80 bucks. This Gruet 2012 Blanc de Blanc, 25 to 30 bucks depending on where you're buying it. If you're buying it in the Southwest, generally it's going to be a little cheaper. In Texas, I would say it's closer probably to that $30 range to get a bottle like this, the 2012 Blanc de Blancs. Now, their Brut non-vintage in Texas, total wine, 12 bucks. Check it out. I'm telling you, it's a banging sparkling wine for $12. Check it out. This one's the 2012 Blanc de Blanc. So what's that mean? We talk a little bit about vintage. Now let's talk about Blanc de Blancs. What does Blanc de Blanc mean? So a classic term from the Champagne region is Blanc de Blanc, which the two grapes, really the two predominant grapes in Champagne, are Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. That doesn't have to be the case other places. Even if you're making it in a Method Champenoise method, it doesn't have to be Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Gruet does use Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. Blanc de Blanc means white wine made with white grapes. So Blanc de Blanc means 100% Chardonnay was used in the production of this wine. So poured a really big kind of frothy head at first, and then it subsided, and right now it's not looking like it's ultra bubbly. Nice kind of pale straw color here, which is absolutely to be expected with a Chardonnay sparkling wine. Really nice kind of bready, yeasty nose like you would expect with any sort of champagne, this being made very similar to the wines that the Gruet family made when they were in France. It does take on a classic kind of champagne characteristic. If you're a big kind of champagne and sparkling wine drinker, you will probably know or know what I'm talking about when I say it's got this bready, yeasty, biscuity kind of nose. That comes from that time that is spent on that yeast. When it goes through the bottle conditioning, the bottle fermentation, that yeast is left in there. Sometimes that's up to 2-3 years that yeast remains in there as the wines are aging. The longer it sits on that yeast, the more bready, toasty characteristics you'll get. Lemon curd, right off the bat. I don't know how many of you guys have had lemon curd before. It's actually quite nice on like an English muffin or something. You can get it at the grocery store. It's almost like a lemon jam, but it's got this creamy texture to it. Lemon curd all over this. It's creamy, it's bready, it's lemony. A little bit of like a yellow apple. It's a lot of yellow stuff on this wine for sure. A little like a nice ripe yellow apple that's got that real creamy texture, not overly sharp and acidic and not overly sweet. There is a good amount of acidity on this wine. not overly bubbly and effervescent. I think with 2012. It's, that's a little bit of a, for domestic sparkling wines, 2012, 7 years old. It's got a little bit of age on it. You'll start to have those bubbles kind of chill out a little bit as they continue to age. I don't think that it's too old though. I think that maybe I feel like maybe I just talked a little bit too much between pouring it and drinking it, because right now it's got a slight effervescence, but not over the top. Really good acidity, creamy palate, a lot of that lemon curd, yellow apple, lemon rind, biscuit. I mean, that's breakfast, guys. That's a breakfast wine right there. Sunday brunch sipper, no doubt about it. I mean, I don't even have to eat anything. When I drink this wine, I'm taking a bite out of a English muffin with some lemon curd on it, and I've got a nice little sliced up apple right next to it. Maybe that's my little pre-brunch breakfast that I have at home before I go out and start pounding some bubbles and get into the eggs and bacon and whatnot. But maybe some chicken and waffles. Really, really nice starter. So that's part one, guys. Wanted to give you the intro. Wanted to hit you with some info on Gruet. Talk about kind of the setup from champagne moving into domestic sparkling wines. So hit the first wine, Blanc de Blanc 2012. Talked about vintage champagne versus non-vintage. Blanc de Blanc, what does that mean? Up next, we're going to start getting into talking a little bit about dosage, which is something that comes after the disgorgement of that yeast after the secondary fermentation takes place. So that'll be part two, guys. Stay tuned. Appreciate you being here for part one of the sparkling wine episode. We'll catch you on episode two. All right, guys. Bye-bye.